Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Marty Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are officially starting Volume 3 of Stars of Chaos, also known as Sha Po Lang by Priest, and I'm super excited. Just to let you guys know in advance, I did have someone in the comments ask me if I would place the illustrations within the video, and I said I would consider it, so I'm at least trying it out for this first video, and I'll just see how I feel about it. But I want to let you guys know, because of the downgrade in paper quality that Seven Seas has been using lately, unfortunately, when I try to get the best scan of these images as possible, the light that was coming from the scan would show up in tiny little squares onto the photos. So unfortunately, I had to use my phone to take a picture, which of course, holding a book open while trying to take a picture as it, bends upward and everything, it's not necessarily the best. So some details may be cropped out so you don't see like my finger trying to hold it down or something like that. But if you really want to see the illustrations, you're just going to have to get the book, whether physical or the ebook, if you want to see every single little detail that I may not have been able to capture. So, like I said, I'm trying it this time around. Not sure if this is something I'm going to consistently do, but anyway, let's get started because who wants to keep rambling? Arc 8, Battle Hymn. Chapter 63, The City's End. A Western envoy had come with offers of peace. This single envoy caused the day's morning court session to spiral into a headache-inducing argument. The instant court was dismissed, Changgong took Master Feng Han's arm and made a beeline for the palace gates, ignoring the crowd of officials attempting to solicit his opinions, each weighed down by their own worries. Anxiety hung heavy over the capital, and the streets were near deserted. Guyuan usually instructed Huo Dan to wait for Changgong outside the palace with his horse at the ready, but today, Huo Dan seemed to have been held up and was nowhere in sight. Changgong didn't think much of it. Strolling shoulder to shoulder with the old director of the Lingshu Institute, he made his way back to the Marquis estate. These days, Master Feng Han hardly left the Lingshu Institute for a moment from dawn till dusk. His eyes had become sullen, and his entire person resembled nothing so much as a dried-out radish. Only his eyes were bright with a wily gleam, as if one would chip their teeth if they tried to take a bite out of him. "Thank you, Your Highness, for your patience in accompanying an old geezer like me with my feeble legs." Master Feng Han sighed. "Is there any news of our reinforcements? When will they arrive?" "The chaos on all four borders is hampering the movements of the 5 military regions," said Changgong. "You know the present state of the regional garrisons. Military budgets and violet gold allocations have shrunk again and again in every region. Most can scarcely support a couple suits of heavy armor, so they're almost uniformly composed of light-pelled cavalrymen. Light-pelled cavalry are fast on the march, flexible, and easy to deploy, but they are also easy to stall. The enemy need only to set up a blockade of heavy armor infantrymen or war chariots, and any less experienced commander will find their forces quickly surrounded. The Westerners can hold up our forces with very few of their own troops." "Your Highness, this leaves me too ashamed to show my face. The Lingshu Institute hasn't produced anything presentable in years." Zhang Fenghan shook his head in self-ridicule. "And here I am, a useless ancient who refuses to die, enjoying the privileges of my office without doing a lick of work. I'd intended to inform His Majesty of my retirement after the turn of the year, only for the nation to fall into this crisis. At this rate, I won't pass peacefully in my bed." "Master Feng Han is laying the foundations on which we will build 1,000 years of prosperity," Changgong said warmly. "You must not belittle yourself." 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, will there still be a Great Liang?" Zhang Fenghan pressed his lips together. "I'd always imagined that after I joined the Lingshu Institute, I could turn away from the affairs outside my window and spend the rest of my life surrounded by steam-powered engines and steel armor, focusing on nothing but excellence in my trade. But this world is such a hive of activity. Even if gentlemen and miscreants stick to their own roads, their paths will eventually collide. The less you wish to mingle, the more you wish to stand above the crowd and achieve a little greatness. The more you shall find you can achieve nothing at all, even if your goal is only to be a lowly mechanic with your hands covered in engine oil. Chang'e understood that Master Feng Han was venting his inner turmoil and had no real interest in his response. He offered a soft chuckle, but said no more. The 2-generation-long conflict between imperial and military power was the catalyst that had precipitated Great Liang's slide to its current precarious state. Yet, it wasn't the most fundamental reason for its decline. The chronic ailments of the nation had sealed its tragic fate the moment its contents of the national treasury began to shrink by the year. The hidden mechanisms of the aerial defense field controlled from Kite's Flight Pavilion are adjusted every day, said Zhang Fenghan. Those Westerners are afraid to deploy large formations of armored hawks and only dare advance toward the city by chariot. Even so, there's a limit to what the aerial defense field can do. I hear the Westerners have been flying wooden kites on strings beyond the city walls. After a few more days of this, I'm afraid the stockpiles of iron arrows within the hidden mechanisms will run low. What will we do then? Does Marshal Gu have a plan? Even if they included in the count those missing an arm or a leg, the suits of Black Hawk armor in the northern camp now numbered less than 100. The failure of the aerial defense field would likely signal the city's end. Chang'e placidly hummed in response. He knows. He's thinking. Zhang Fenghan, burdened with a heart full of worries, was torn between laughter and tears. He didn't know whether he should laud this Prince Yanbei for displaying such heroic character at his young age or be concerned that there was something deeply wrong with his head. Master Fenghan thought that even if the sky should collapse in front of his nose, the young prince would only offer a detached, "Understood." Lowering his voice, Zhang Fenghan said, "Your Highness, did you notice Captain Han missing from court today? A rumor is spreading that although His Majesty made a show of fury toward the Western envoy, he is making plans to move the capital even now." Chang'e chuckled, seemingly unsurprised. "His Majesty is planning no such thing. We have not been maneuvered into a corner just yet. Ah, I see a carriage from the Lingshu Institute now. Allow me to help you up. Oh, Uncle Huo is here." Huo Dan was hurrying in their direction, unease writ clearly across his face. "This servant has arrived late. Please forgive me, Your Highness," he said, striding up to Chang'e. "It's no matter." Chang'e waved aside his apology. "Uncle Huo, were you delayed by some business?" Huo Dan eyed Chang'e warily as he spoke. "Last night, the Marquis was wounded by a Western arrow. I only found out this morning and had just gone to—" "Your Highness?" Under Huo Dan and Zhang Fenghan's open-mouthed stares, a transformation came over Chang'e's face. The prince, who had been strolling casually seconds ago, leapt onto his horse and disappeared like a gust of wind. Outside the 9 gates, the gunpowder smoke had yet to disperse. The Western forces had made a dejected retreat shortly after daybreak, and Guyuan had finally gotten a moment to breathe. A dent marred one of his black iron pauldrons. The arrow head had already been extracted, but 2 medics were still orbiting him with forceps and scissors, carefully prying the deformed armor off his shoulder. Beneath lay a mess of fabric plastered to bloody flesh. Chang'e charged inside, but no sooner had he laid eyes on Guyuan than he had to avert his gaze. The look on his face was bleaker than that of the injured party. "Can the 2 of you get this over with?" Guyuan hissed in pain. "Are you doing embroidery here?" He turned to Chang'e. "What is it?" Chang'e didn't immediately respond. He took a deep breath and stepped over to Guyuan, waving the 2 medics away. Bending down, he carefully examined the piece of armor embedded in Guyuan's shoulder. Then he pulled out a pair of shears the length of a finger, wrapped an arm around Guyuan's shoulder, and began to cut from the other side. Chang'e worked with swift movements, and the sharp blades of the shears carved through iron as if scraping away mud, prying away shards of the pauldron. Blood rushed out and coated his hand. Changgang's entire face was pinched, and for a moment he could scarcely breathe. "You were injured this badly. Why didn't you tell me?" Guyuan had been grimacing in pain as the medics worked, but now he forced every trace of it from his features. "This is nothing," he said through a clenched jaw. "What did the Western envoy say in court?" "What do you expect?" "He was there to blow hot air before the throne, of course." Changgong shook out his faintly trembling hands before continuing to remove the shattered bits of armor glued to Guyuan's body with drying blood. "He demanded we cease our persecution and exploitation of the nations in the western regions, concede all territory beyond Jiayu Pass for use as an international trade zone within which the law of their own nation would be enforced, and—" The entire deformed pauldron was at last removed. Changgong sucked in a breath at the sight of Guyuan's injury, then struggled to his feet to gather himself. "What else?" Guyuan shivered. Cold sweat had drenched his body. "My esteemed doctor, don't tell me you faint at the sight of blood." Changgong was as stiff as an iron rod. "I faint at the sight of your blood." He snatched Guyuan's wine flask and swallowed 2 large gulps, his head spinning so violently he thought he might puke. He forced himself to take 2 more steadying breaths, then plucked up a pair of scissors and began to cut away Guyuan's clothes, which were so stained with blood he could no longer discern their original color. "And concede the 36 commanderies along the northern border to the 18 tribes," he finally continued. "Everything north of the line stretching from the old western capital to Zhili and You Prefecture. On top of that, they are demanding that Great Liang's seat of government be moved to the old eastern capital in the Central Plains, and Princess Hening is to be handed over to the 18 tribes as a hostage. Henceforth, our government is to declare allegiance to the 18 tribes and offer a yearly tribute." Hening was Li Feng's only daughter. She was just 7 years old. "Bullshit!" Guyuan spat in rage. Blood began pouring from his shoulder. "Don't move!" Changgong snapped, unable to bear much more of the gory sight. The two stared at each other, a turbulent expression in Guyuan's eyes. A long moment later, he finally broke the silence. "Continue." "They're also demanding Li Feng order Shenyi's southern border army to retreat from the islands in the South Sea. The Westerners wish to set up a separate territory bordered by the East Sea Canal. They're demanding that the Jiangnan Navy retreat inland of the canal and that the land beyond the canal all the way to the East Sea be ceded to them as a far eastern district under Western control." The look in Changgong's eyes was gloomy, but his hands were surpassingly gentle as he wiped the blood from Guyuan's wounds. He paused for a beat, then went on. "Then there are the reparations." Guyuan's body tensed. At morning court, Li Feng wanted to execute the envoy on the spot, but the officials managed to persuade him to leave the man alive. Changgong placed a hand on Guyuan's uninjured shoulder. "I need to clean the wound. Yifu, may I give you something to put you under?" Guyuan shook his head no. "Just a little bit of medicine," Changgong coaxed. "You have a high tolerance, so you won't be asleep for long. If anything happens outside the city gates, I'll guard them for you." "Just clean it," Guyuan interrupted. "Enough with the chatter." Changgong leveled him with a long look. Trying to reason with this person was useless. At that moment, Tan Hongfei ran inside. "Sir!" Guyuan had just turned toward him when he detected a strange fragrance in the air. Caught off guard, he breathed it in and immediately went weak. The wise and powerful Marquis of Order had never expected His Highness the Commandery Prince to know a Jianghu trick like hiding secret drugs up his sleeves, much less that he would use them on him. "You—" Changgong didn't so much as blink as he rapidly inserted thin needles into Guyuan's acupoints, then caught his godfather's limp body. Having witnessed his own marshal taken down before his eyes, Tan Hongfei froze in the doorway and stared blankly at the commandery prince. Changgong gestured for him to hold his tongue, then lifted Guyuan and laid him on his back to begin carefully cleaning the arrow wound. Tan Hongfei's eyes nearly popped out of his head. This, don't worry. Let him get some sleep and suffer a bit less. Tan Hongfei blinked. Some time ago, he had seen Prince Yanbei as an amicable scholar. Later, he had discovered this prince was capable both on and off the battlefield and came to respect him, feeling that he was a kindred spirit. It was only now that Commander Tan felt the first spark of a burning reverence for this man. Tan Hongfei's hand came up to touch his own cheek, where the scar from Guyuan's whip had yet to fade. His Highness has got some serious guts, he thought. Chang'eng turned to face him. Ah, what were you going to say? Tan Hongfei recovered his wits and said in a rush, Your Highness, His Majesty is here. His carriage is out back now. What should we... Li Feng arrived while they were speaking, his face haggard. He was dressed in casual clothes and was accompanied only by Zhu Xiaojiao. The emperor peered down at the unconscious Guyuan and reached out to feel his forehead. Is uncle well? Just a flesh wound. Chang'eng finished bandaging the injury, then wrapped a thin silk outer robe around Guyuan's body and tidied away his acupuncture needles. I administered some anesthetic, so he won't wake for some time. I hope brother will take no offense. With that, Chang'eng rose, picked up Guyuan's windslasher, and turned to walk out the door without donning a single piece of armor. Where are you going? Li Feng called after him. I'll guard the city gates in Yifu's stead, Chang'eng said. Even if their envoy is in the capital, the Westerners aren't to be trusted. They may yet attack while our guard is down. We can never be too careful. Li Feng stood stiffly in place for a moment, then grabbed a sword and made to follow Chang'eng. Zhu Xiaojiao was shocked. Your Majesty! Li Feng ignored him and climbed to the top of the city wall alone. The long-gone emperor lifted his field scope and saw the tents of the Western army lined up not far away. The fertile soil on the capital's surroundings was pitted with scars. The roads beyond the city gates, which had so recently flowed with rivers of horses and carriages, were now deserted. A collapsed corner of the city wall was held up by broken pieces of black iron armor. As he watched, it teetered precariously, yet obstinately remained standing. The rank-and-file soldiers of the northern camp all knew Chang'eng and stepped forward to greet him, but none recognized Li Feng. When they saw his refined dress and noble bearing, they took him for a civil official and murmured a greeting of, "My lord," in unison. The Li brothers, whose harmonious relationship was skin-deep at best, stood shoulder to shoulder atop the city wall. From their faces to their figures, they were alike in not a single aspect. Their familial bond was as thin as a paper window that could be torn by a finger. Han Qi should be back by the afternoon, Li Feng said suddenly. Relay the message to uncle. Tell him to have someone he trusts receive him. Chang'eng didn't inquire after his intentions, as if he wasn't the least bit curious. He assented briefly to the request. Why aren't you asking where we sent Han Qi? Chang'eng cast his eyes down to the stone bricks that made up the city wall. After a moment of silence, he said, Lately, I've been reallocating violet gold and other military necessities with the Ministry of Revenue. I discovered a few discrepancies in the figures for violet gold acquired and dispensed by the court. But perhaps brother has been making his own arrangements. When the long-gone emperor heard this, he knew Chang'eng had long noticed the violet gold he had been stockpiling in secret. Ah, Li Feng began, a bit awkwardly. Inside the Gate of Virtuous Triumph, there's a secret passage that leads to the Sunlight Palace. We ordered Han Qi to take some troops, exit the city through this passage, and open the secret warehouse in the Sunlight Palace, which contains, he coughed, then continued, 80,000 kilograms of violet gold that we have not yet gotten around to allocating. Keep this to yourself. The court is losing their resolve, and if they learn of the secret passage, I am afraid they will waver. Chang'eng nodded but showed no sign of surprise. Li Feng was emptying his coffers. Someone as headstrong as the long-gone emperor would never bring shame upon his nation by pledging allegiance to another. He would rather be buried below these 9 gates. Once Chang'eng fell silent, the conversation stuttered to an end. Actually, this was always the way with these two. Aside from political debate in court and hollow niceties exchanged when Chang'eng came to pay his respects, the Li brothers truly had nothing to say to each other. Li Feng finally hit upon a topic. How old were you when you met Uncle Shiliu? A pause. 12. Li Feng hummed in acknowledgement. He has yet to marry and spends long stretches of time leading troops in the northwest. He must have been rather neglectful when it came to your care. Chang'eng's eyes flashed. No, he's very good at doting on people. Li Feng squinted into the faint traces of light on the horizon and recalled how he, too, had grown up with Gu Yun. In his youth, he had felt the occasional sting of jealousy over the imperial father's treatment of Gu Yun. He was better to him, gentler to him. But by and large, Li Feng had still retained a good opinion of his young imperial uncle, even if the boy didn't often play with the rest of them. He had once thought these youthful sentiments could persist for a lifetime. Yet within the span of a few decades, their relationship had deteriorated to this point. Amin, Li Feng said. If the city falls, we will abdicate the throne in your favor. Take the harem and the officials, make your departure through the secret tunnels, and establish a new capital in Luoyang. The rest can be taken one step at a time. A day when we can once again rally our forces will come. Chang'eng finally spared him a glance. And if it does, Li Feng said, staring calm-eyed into the distance, you need not return the throne to the crown prince, as long as you provide your nieces and nephews a place of refuge. Chang'eng was silent. After a beat, he said, calm and unmoved, Brother, you are getting ahead of yourself. Our circumstances are not yet so dire. Li Feng gazed at his youngest brother. A faint recollection rose in his mind. Something his empress mother had told him when he was young. All northern barbarian women were enchantresses, adept at using poison and casting spells on people's hearts. Their vile spawn were beasts who polluted the imperial bloodline of Great Liang. Later, after the Marquis of Anding retrieved the fourth prince who had been lost among the commoners and fetched him back to the palace, Li Feng had allowed the boy to stay as a concession to the late emperor's final wishes and an attestation to his own reputation of benevolent virtue. It cost him nothing save an extra allowance from the department of the imperial household, and the little prince normally stayed out of sight and out of mind. It wasn't until this moment that the long-gone emperor discovered he couldn't read this young man at all. He remained composed in the face of national peril and a great enemy army. Even the prospect of sitting on the imperial throne did not move him. He seemed to be dressed in last year's clothes. The hems of his sleeves had grown thin from wear, yet he didn't change them out for a fresh set. He was more of a puzzle than even Great Master Liao Chi of the National Temple. He showed no partiality toward anything, as if nothing on earth could move him. Li Feng had just opened his mouth to say more when Zhu Xiaojiao quietly reminded him from where he stood on the side, Your Majesty, it is time to return to the palace. The emperor came back to himself and handed his sword to a nearby soldier. He patted Chang'eng's shoulder without a word. With a last glance at the young man's ruler straight back, he turned to leave. After Li Feng left, a travel-worn monk ascended the city wall. Liao Zhen. All the monks of the National Temple had retreated inside the city. By day, Liao Zhen recited scriptures with the abbot in prayer for the nation. By night, he liaised with his informants investigating Li Feng's servants. Chang'eng cast him a questioning glance. Liao Zhen shook his head. I went down the whole list, but all His Majesty's servants are clean. None had close dealings with the shamaness of the 18 tribes or her entourage. For a moment, Chang'eng considered. His Majesty is paranoid by nature and is not a man incapable of guarding his own secrets. The leak on our side has been continuous, so the traitor must be one of his closest confidants. Have you looked into Zhu Gonggong? Liao Zhen shook his head again, his expression grim. He had, but found nothing out of place. Chang'eng frowned. It was at this instant that Gu Yuan finally awoke after being knocked out with both medicine and acupuncture. He had fallen so deeply asleep that he hardly knew what day was when he opened his eyes. Not until he felt the ache in his shoulders did he belatedly recall what had transpired. Guyuan crawled out of bed and pulled on his clothes, prepared to get even with Chang'e. Yet no sooner had he stepped outside than he heard a loud boom that shook the entire capital. Guyuan put a hand on the city wall for support. An earthquake? Atop the wall, Chang'e's head whipped around, a vicious look flashing across his face. He always thought the traitor within the capital was among Li Feng's servants. But Li Feng was cautious and paranoid. How could he have revealed the secret of the Sunlight Palace to a mere servant? What was that? Guyuan asked. I don't know. Chang'e took the stairs down in rapid steps. Li Feng isn't here. He said he ordered Han Qi to exit the city through a secret passage to transport violet gold from the Sunlight Palace. Did it sound like it came from the west? With the start, Guyuan found that he was now fully awake. On the 9th day of the 5th month, the secret buried within the Sunlight Palace was blown sky high. The far westerners' offer of peace was indeed a ruse, but they hadn't planned to use the opportunity to attack the city directly. Instead, they'd sent troops to circle around to the west and intercept Han Qi. After a bitter struggle with the western troops, the tides had turned against Han Qi. He made a snap decision and set the tens of thousands of kilograms of violet gold alight, detonating the secret passage and ensuring not a drop of fuel was left behind. Raging like a prairie fire, the great blaze devoured the entire western outskirts. Li Feng's bottomless well of violet gold burned like karmic fire summoned from deep within the earth. Sending the imperial guards who'd been sent to escort the violet gold, the surprised far westerners, and even the exquisite scenery and elegant architecture of the Sunlight Palace up in flames. The telltale purple fumes glowed across half the heavens like an auspicious omen, as if a vividly painted dawn ascended from the horizon. The heart of the earth was burning, and the capital trembled in its wake. A wall of heat expanded dozens of kilometers in every direction, until it gradually seeped through even the rock-solid capital gates from the west. The capital's mild early summer submitted to a heat rivaling the furnace of the southern border. The scent of violet gold, ordinarily indiscernible, billowed in on the westerly wind, and the citizens of the capital at last experienced that unique aroma. It was in fact a clean sort of fragrance, difficult to describe, like sharp pine rosin mixed with a hint of grassy roundness. Guyuan deployed every suit of heavy armor that remained to him and drew taut the string of every Parhelion bow. Yet, as he expected, the main body of the Western army made its move to counter. Guyuan knew not how many of the Western army's men had been incinerated by the fire, nor did he know how long the Pope could last at this high rate of attrition. The siege had been long, and both sides were at their limit. The first frenzied wave of attack came in the middle of the afternoon. Heavy armor and war chariots advanced in turns, and shot after shot roared from cannons and Parhelion bows in a seamless, violent cacophony. Chapter 64. In Desperate Straits. Clouds of dust and the clamor of war surged on all sides. The air grew hot and sear in the wake of the great conflagration to the west of the city, and sweat rolled down the soldiers' backs. The screech of an armored hawk taking flight sounded from afar. Though the aerial defense field had yet to fail completely, the far westerners had lost their patience. They sent countless armored hawks to challenge the defenses with their very lives. This western army had been stalled by Guyuan for over a month, then routed by the capital's forces at the city gates and stymied by the aerial defense field. Every day, they suffered unimaginable losses, and each day they spent in fruitless labor chipped away at the patience their faraway western masters had for this eastern expedition over a decade in the making. Under the city walls, Chang'e grabbed Liao Zhen. "Listen to me," he said quickly. "There's no way the person we're looking for is the palace servant, and we've investigated all of Li Feng's closest advisors more than once. The previous dynasty fell at the hands of sycophants and flatterers. Our dynasty has never allowed eunuchs to hold power. No matter what else His Majesty has done, he wouldn't be so absurd as to have eunuchs handle the Sunlight Palace. Nor could that person be one of the court officials. Han Chi's departure had the whole court in a state of anxiety, with everyone speculating that His Majesty planned to flee. Yet Li Feng kept his cool and didn't say a thing. He intended to abdicate the throne in my favor. Yet he only offered me the information in person once Han Chi was nearly back. Liao Zhan stared at him blankly. This imperial brother of mine distrusts generals in times of peace and civil officials in times of war. Chang'eng muttered, "Who could it be? Who else is in there?" Liao Zhan's fingers froze on the prayer beads he had been unconsciously turning, and he drew in a cold breath. This eminent monk, who so resembled the reincarnation of a Buddhist locust, suddenly wore an expression so grave he looked like a corpse. Chang'eng's heavy gaze turned on him, slowly enunciating every word he said. "The national temple is to the west of the city." A stray explosive landed near the two of them, and both Chang'eng and Liao Zhan were knocked off their feet by the force of the blast. Chang'eng staggered upright, but the prayer beads around the monk's neck burst off their string at the impact. The aged wooden beads scattered into the wretched mortal dust. Chang'eng dragged Liao Zhan up by the collar, helping him stumble to a standing position. "Get up, let's go. If we kill the wrong man, count it on my head." Liao Zhan shook his head as if on reflex. He had thought that, after his many years of cultivation, he had already seen through the joy and sorrow of the human world. But in this moment, like encountering demons in the latter day of the Dharma, he finally discovered that any pretensions he had of transcending the physical world were mere overconfident illusions. Chang'eng pushed Liao Zhan and stared into the pale-faced monk's frightened eyes. "I'm not afraid of karmic retribution. I'll take care of it. Great Master, don't stop me. Don't blame me either." When Chang'eng had still been young and innocent, he had already suffered a full gamut of every frightful retribution the world had to offer. There was nothing in this world or the next that could give him pause. "I'm going to borrow some men from Yifu," Chang'eng said. Liao Zhan was still frozen in place. The young commandery prince made a peculiar gesture. He curled his thumb in and pressed his palm down slightly. The wide sleeves of his court robes sliced through the air with his movements, and the metallic embroidery flashed like silver dragonfish darting over the surface of a river. "When times are prosperous, we are content to till the land, to study our books, and to roam the depths of the Jianghu." Liao Zhan's entire body was shaking. After a long interval, he raised trembling hands to press his palms together and bow in Chang'eng's direction. "When chaos is imminent and the abyss looms near, we shall die 1,000 deaths to save the people. This path is called Lin Yuan, to approach the abyss." Chang'eng chuckled lowly. Fake monk. With that, he turned and ran toward the city gate. Tears poured down Liao Zhan's face. "Those who have not known suffering believe in no God nor Buddha." What few Black Hawks survived were all in the air. Guyuan had gathered every remaining scrap of firepower in the capital and now sent it pelting down from the city walls in a last desperate struggle. Within the city gate, heavy armor infantry lined up at the ready, and for the first time, Chang'eng saw Guyuan abandon his light pelt for a suit of heavy armor. His bloodless face seemed to take on some of the boundless, rock-solid color of the black iron around him. When his personal guard reported Prince Yanbei's arrival, Guyuan's head snapped around, his expression darker than when he was getting an arrow extracted from his shoulder. He strode forward and grabbed Chang'eng's arm in his iron gauntlets. "What are you doing back here?" "How's it looking?" Chang'eng asked. "The far westerners are losing their patience. What are your plans?" Guyuan said nothing as he dragged Chang'eng down from the city wall. His answer was clear in his silence. "What else is there to do but to defend our position to the end?" The attack on Captain Han Chi was no coincidence. "There is a traitor near Li Feng," Chang'eng said. "Yifu, lend me a squadron of guards. I will resolve the hidden danger that lurks in the city. Elsewise, if our enemies remain able to coordinate from within and without, it will be only a matter of time until the city falls. Changung! Guyuan wiped his habitual irreverence from his face. Your Highness, I will send a squadron of guards to escort you away. Look after yourself on your journey, and don't come back again. Traitor or no, it was likely only a matter of time until the city fell. Changung's eyebrow jumped. He had a feeling Guyuan didn't mean solely away from the capital's gates and into the city proper. An enormous crash came from behind. A heavy artillery strike from the Westerners had slammed into the city wall, leaving the gate that had stood impregnable for centuries trembling in its wake. The mottled outer surface of the wall crumbled pitifully away, exposing the black iron beams and interlocking iron gears within. The face of the city wall was peeled back, revealing the fearsome flesh and blood beneath. The headless corpse of the Black Hawk plummeted to the ground nearby. Guyuan pulled Changung into the safety of his heavy-armored embrace as a giant chunk of falling stone smashed down behind him, loose debris tapping out a discordant cacophony against the black iron. The two were mere centimeters apart, practically breathing the same air. They hadn't been this close since Changung had begun deliberately keeping his distance. Guyuan's breath was searing. Perhaps he was running a fever. Yet his gaze was sharp and bright as ever. What else did His Majesty say when he was here? Guyuan asked, his words rapid-fire in Changung's ear. Do as he said. Go! When Li Feng had come, Guyuan was unconscious. The two hadn't even laid eyes on each other. This lord and subject had continuously speculated on each other's motivations, always suspicious and on guard beneath a veneer of affected harmony. But in the nation's time of extremity, both understood what the other was thinking. Changung's pupils contracted. He reached into the heavy armor to pull Guyuan down by the neck and, throwing all caution to the wind, pressed a kiss to those wind-chapped lips. It was the first time he had tasted Guyuan while they were both sober. The kiss burned, as if he were about to self-combust, and carried the faint tang of blood. Changung's heart pounded so hard in his chest he felt it would crack, not because of some phony sense of honeyed joy as written in tales of romance. Instead, a wildfire capable of engulfing heaven and earth roared to life in his heart, a raging inferno entrapped within mortal flesh, on the verge of bursting from its confines and devouring the present and future of this nation teetering on the brink of destruction. The moment felt as long as hundreds of centuries, yet shorter than the blink of an eye. Guyuan dragged Changung off himself. Human strength was no match for the power of the black iron heavy armor. But he didn't lose his temper, nor did he toss Changung indiscriminately to the side. He gently opened his iron gauntlets, treating Changung as if he were something precious as he set him down a few paces away. Without 1,000 different fetters and barriers of etiquette, could burning devotion in desperate straits melt even Guyuan's iron heart? If he was prepared to die upon these city walls, would the last person whose lips he felt upon his own in this lifetime spare him from feeling he had left absolutely nothing precious behind when he set off down the road to the Yellow Springs? Would it offer comfort, or would it merely seem absurd? At that moment, there was no one in the world who could read a single one of Guyuan's thoughts from his handsome face. Changung fixed his gaze on him and spoke in tones as calm as still water. Zishi, I need to intercept the traitor in the city, so I can't keep you company here any longer. If anything happens to you today... A faint smile appeared on his face. He shook his head, deciding that words like, I swear I won't live on alone, would make him appear too weak. Guyuan would laugh at him, but it wouldn't have been an empty promise. Or was he supposed to drag out a meaningless existence with the Wu-Er-Ge as his closest companion? He didn't hate himself that much. Guyuan sucked in a deep breath. Old Tan! A Black Hawk screeched down from above. Tan Hongfei. Guyuan gave his orders. Assemble a squadron of light-pelled cavalrymen. You will personally escort His Highness. He climbed back up the city wall without a backward glance. Firebrand arrows loaded onto Parhelion bows sped through the air in neat arcs, meeting the attacking Western Hawks mid-air in a violent clash. This was the final batch of firebrand arrows delivered by the Lingshu Institute. Their enemy built a ladder from human flesh, a bridge from sunken corpses, throwing themselves forward in endless waves of reckless onslaught. A Western Hawk used a comrade's mangled remains as cover to brashly swoop past the line of Parhelion bows atop the wall and launch a cannon blast toward the center of the city, striking Kite's flight pavilion. A Black Hawk collided with the Western assailant. One of the Black Hawk's iron wings was malfunctioning, and thick, dark smoke poured from the back of his armor. He had not a single remaining weapon and could only cling to his enemy by the shoulders, dragging them both tumbling from the sky. Before they could hit the ground, the Hawk's overloaded gold tank exploded, and the brief flash of the resultant flames engulfed both the Black Hawk and his Western foe. Mutual destruction. After suffering the cannon strike, the moonshot platform of Kite's flight pavilion listed to and fro before collapsing with a great rumble. Now, all that could be seen from the great Yunmeng outlook was its crumbling ruins. That grand capital that had seen 100 years of prosperity, those glorious dreams of eternity floating above the red walls and golden tiles, now collapsed to the ground amid the shattering of colored glass and turned to dust. Pandemonium reigned in the great audience hall. Zhu Xiaojiao stumbled over and threw himself at Li Feng's feet, choking his words out through sobs. Your Majesty, the 9 gates are about to fall. Please relocate. The servant has already ordered his Yizi to prepare a carriage and commoner's clothes and wait by the north gate. 130 imperial guards remain inside the palace. They would give their lives to allow your Majesty to break through the siege. Li Feng raised a foot and kicked him to the ground. How dare a servant make decisions on his master's behalf? Get out! He turned back toward the rest of the room. Bring us the Shangfang sword. When Wang Guo heard this, he sank to the floor in a bow. Your Majesty, you must think this through. As long as our lord and ruler is well, the foundations of the state remain. In the future, there will... As he spoke, an imperial guard presented the Shangfang sword to the emperor with both hands. Li Feng drew it and knocked Imperial Uncle Wang's black gauze official's hat from his head with one thrust, then strode toward the door. Zhu Xiaojiao scrambled after him. Like a herd of sheep that had found a bellwether to lead them, the terrified ministers and officials trailed after Li Feng in a single file. Outside the north gate, the imperial guards had pushed Zhu Xiaojiao's pair of powder-faced godsons to the side, where they were calling out to Zhu Xiaojiao in a panic. Impudent! Zhu Xiaojiao shouted in his high-pitched voice. How dare you! This eunuch was a favorite of the emperor, after all. The imperial guards hesitated and accidentally let the 2 kept men slip by them to take charge inside. At the same time, Great Master Liao Chi of the National Temple appeared on his way to meet them, leading a crowd of monks in warrior attire. He stopped before Li Feng. Li Feng's severe features relaxed, but as he made to greet Great Master Liao Chi, one of Zhu Xiaojiao's powder-faced godsons suddenly raised his head, a mask of bloodlust on his previously subservient face. From his position at Zhu Xiaojiao's heels, 5 steps from the long-gone emperor, he blew a blow dart from his opened mouth. For an instant, everyone was too shocked to react. At the most critical moment, Zhu Xiaojiao lunged forth with a shout. His broad frame crashed into Li Feng's back, and he blocked the fatal blow with his own body. Li Feng staggered and nearly fell into Liao Chi's arms. He turned, a mixture of shock and fury surging through him. Zhu Xiaojiao's eyes were wide, as if still in disbelief that his docile godson had transformed into an assassin. The old eunuch's body twitched like a wooden puppet on strings as he breathed his last without uttering a single word more. Li Feng's breath caught in his throat, but at the same instant he heard an Amitabha Buddha from behind him. Before the long-gone emperor could begin to grieve, an icy hand was pressed against his throat. Hidden within his sleeve, Great Master Liao Chi was wearing an iron claw. This monstrous hand, which could crush stone with ease, gripped the Longan Emperor's fragile neck, and the Shangfang sword clattered to the ground. The officials and imperial guard were all struck dumb. Jiang Chong, a frail scholar who hadn't the strength to subdue a chicken, somehow found the guts to step forward and confront Liao Chi. "Abbot, have you gone mad?" Liao Chi raised his head to look at him, still wearing a melancholy expression that never left his face. He chuckled. "Amitabha Buddha, this humble monk has not gone mad. Just this Jiang. You may not have even been born when Emperor Wu recklessly exhausted the strength of his military to whet his black iron sword warring against his neighbors on all four borders." "What?" One of Liao Chi's warrior monks stepped forward and uttered a string of syllables to Liao Chi in a language Jiang Chong didn't understand. Moments later, several heavy armor infantrymen emerged from all directions and fell into formation behind the monks. The minister of state ceremonial cried out in shock, "A Dongying man!" Liao Chi laughed again. "After Emperor Wu's gold consolidation decree, all 16 members of my family died at the hands of his black crows. I was left alone to drag out a pointless existence. I found myself in your esteemed state, and thanks to the general pardon granted at the time of the former Marquis Gu's marriage to the eldest princess, I became a free man. I cut all ties with the secular world and took endless study by lamplight as my constant companion. After 46 years of painstaking effort, this day has finally come." Li Fang spoke haltingly through the cold grip around his neck. "You are a descendant of those condemnable violet gold smugglers." "Smugglers," Liao Chi echoed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's right. It's all the fault of violet gold. Your Majesty, your tongue is sharp and your heart is stone. But are your bones the same? Please relocate with me to the red-headed kite." Li Fang began. "Your Majesty believes in my Buddha," Liao Chi said. "If you believe in the Buddha, then you believe in this humble monk. There is little difference." Liao Chi shoved Li Fang onto a red-headed kite and ordered his subordinates to take the coiling dragon banner from the imperial carriage and hang it from the vessel's stern. "Cut the ropes and release the kite," Liao Chi said. "Spread the news. His Majesty plans to abandon the city and escape by air." "How dare you, you miscreant!" Jiang Chong yelled. Liao Chi laughed out loud. "Anyone who would like to commit regicide, please be my guest and step forward." Just then, a great roar tore itself from someone's throat a short distance away. Liao Chi started and turned. Atop the rubble of moonshot platform stood Liao Zhen. The mute monk's throat had been malformed since birth. Even exerting all his strength, he could produce only a wordless cry. It was a rather inelegant noise, and accordingly, no one who knew Great Master Liao Zhen had ever heard him make a sound. His image before all was graceful as a cool breeze, an expression of compassion ever present on his face. The previous abbot of the National Temple had taken him as an abandoned infant, but it had been his Shishong, Liao Chi, who raised him. He had been an unruly child who didn't seem much like a proper monk, and had begun slipping out of the temple to wander the Jianghu at scarcely more than 10 years old, even going to join the Lingyuan pavilion. Yet even so, his youthful affections for his Shishong may have faded over time, but they had never left him entirely. "Shishong," Liao Zhen signed at him. "It's not too late to come back to shore." Liao Chi stared at the Shudi and he had raised from childhood with a complicated expression. He, too, failed to resist the tug of nostalgia. After a brief moment of distraction, he muttered in reply, "The river has already dried up. Where is the—" Before the word shore could leave his mouth, in the brief instant Liao Chi lowered his guard, a bolt the length of a palm flew out from an impossible angle and buried itself neatly into his throat. Everyone cried out in shock. A black hawk bore down on them, flying low through the air. Standing on the black hawk's back, Chang'an held a crossbow, the string still vibrating. With his wind slasher in hand, the Black Hawk, Tan Hongfei, blocked 2 more attacks from the Dongying warrior monks with a wave of his iron arm. "What are you all waiting for?" Jiang Chong yelled. "Protect His Majesty!" The Imperial Guard swarmed forward, and a squadron of light-pelt cavalry in black iron armor charged in through a narrow alleyway. Li Feng shoved Liao Che away, and the body of the most eminent monk of his generation tumbled from the deck of the red-headed kite. Liao Ren knelt, devastated, in the rubble. Nowhere in this nation, nowhere in this world, bounded by oceans to the east and west and extending endlessly to the north and south, was there room for a single tiny shrine, far from mortal dust. The Dongying warrior monks and the Imperial Guard were soon embroiled in a chaotic battle. A heavy armor infantryman who had come with Liao Che fired his cannon into the sky, and Tan Hongfei made a steep vertical descent. Chang'eng leapt nimbly from his back to land on one knee, and the two parted ways as debris flew through the air. Chang'eng briefly met Li Feng's eyes as he unslung his Parhelion longbow, pressed his back to a wall, and drew the iron bowstring to its limit, the bow curving like the full moon. With a sharp screech that vibrated through the teeth of all present, his arrow punched through the heavy armor's gold tank. He jumped back out of range, and the gold tank exploded. The red-headed kite heaved from the blast of hot air. Li Feng grabbed the railing. "Tan Hongfei, get this damn thing started and take us to the city gates." Startled, Tan Hongfei glanced hesitantly toward Chang'eng. Chang'eng's gaze was dark, but his silence constituted tacit permission. The red-headed kite conveyed the emperor toward the city gates with over 100 imperial guards and every important official following on foot behind it in a winding procession. There were 6 kilometers of blue stone road between Kite's Flight Pavilion and the city gates. As they advanced, more and more local citizens and refugees who had fled to the capital poured in from both sides of the road to join their ranks, like rivers meeting the sea. At the same time, the defense of the city walls was finally beginning to falter. The aerial defense field had gone mute, and the capital's forces had fired the last of their firebrand arrows. From atop the city wall, Guyuan called out an order to open the gates. Ranks of black iron heavy armor infantrymen who had long waited for this moment marched through. Guyuan, in the lead, turned to give a hand signal to the injured soldiers who had stepped up to man the mechanisms atop the wall, and the gates slowly ground shut behind the heavy armor formation. Guyuan lowered his iron visor. One by one, every heavy armor infantryman behind him followed suit. Chapter 65. Survival is Found. The heavy armor formation moved out. The battered city walls trembled with the thunder of their lockstep footfalls. Submerged in a cloud of white snow steam impervious to any breeze, a dark front of black iron armor swarmed against the torrential current of the enemy army's cannon fire. The first wave of heavy armor swept across the battlefield like an anti-cavalry saber, advancing straight toward the heart of the enemy formation. Heads and limbs detached in the repeated blasts lay scattered over the earth, but raging fire couldn't melt black iron. As long as the gold tanks of their armor hadn't exploded, those corpses who had failed to complete their quest in life could yet stand. The flesh and blood soldiers within the iron had already perished, but mechanical gears still turned, continuing their forward charge as if the lingering spirits of their operations had returned to the battlefield. Only when their legs failed to move would later waves of soldiers pry open the gold tanks on their backs and ignite the fuses encased within. Hidden beneath iron visors, each soldier was indistinguishable, merely one of the unidentifiable thousands. There was no difference between a marquis with the fiefdom of 10,000 households or a fresh recruit from the northern camp. They either charged through cannon fire, wind slashers in hand, leaping over the severed heads of their enemies, or disappeared in an anonymous firework of purple flame. Li Feng stood on the deck of the red-headed kite, hands clasped behind his back. He turned to Tan Hongfei, who stood at attention beside him. "Where's Amin?" Tan Hongfei was startled to be called on out of the blue. After a brief pause, he said, His Highness the Commandery Prince went to the city wall. A hot wind blew away the anger on Li Feng's face. He rescued his calm amid his battle-torn surroundings and tossed the newly retrieved Shangfang's sword to Tan Hongfei, who was still in his Black Hawk armor. Deliver our verbal edict. In this time of national emergency, the Crown Prince is young and unsuited for heavy responsibility. Our lack of ability and virtue has left the nation and its people in dire straits, and we have disappointed our ancestors. We shall abdicate in favor of Prince Yanbei. We don't have time to draft a proper edict. Bring this to him and escort him from the city. Tan Hongfei fumbled to catch the heavy sword and snuck a glance at the imperial visage. His eyes snagged on the gray streaking the Longan Emperor's temples. Li Feng waved him off without another word. Chang'e had climbed the city wall with bow in hand and taken command of the aerial front. Tan Hongfei touched down next to Chang'e amid the roar of Parhelion bows, holding the Shangfang sword like a hot potato. Your Highness. With a single glance from the corner of his eye, Chang'e knew what he was about to say. Your Highness, His Majesty said. Just then, an injured soldier who had lost his leg hobbled over on his remaining foot. Your Highness, the firebrand arrows have run out. If we run out of firebrand arrows, use iron ones. If we run out of iron arrows, load the masterless wind slashers. What's there to panic over? We will make our stand here until the city wall crumbles to dust. Chang'e didn't even blink, but his next words were extremely blunt. Commander Tan, take that thing back and tell Li Feng that I owe him nothing, and I will not become the solitary ruler of a conquered nation in his place. He is currently a living banner of command. In a standoff between two armies, the banner cannot be allowed to fall. It is the banner that gives our brothers the courage to lay down their lives. Keep an eye on him. Don't let him go off and die. At this moment, as far as Commander Tan was concerned, even 10 Li Feng's giving him orders wouldn't hold the same weight as a word from Chang'e. He ejected the Emperor's verbal edict from his mind without a word of protest. Commander Tan whistled a long note and several Black Hawks swooped in, ready to defend the Emperor's red-headed kite to the last. Beneath the city walls, the heavy armor formation carved a path through their enemies with wave upon wave of human flesh. Once the heavy armor broke the enemy formation, there was no more use for the rumbling cannons and roaring Parhelion bows. The ground became the site of a desperate life-or-death struggle. Caught in a temporary bind down below, the Western Army had no choice but to throw more force behind its attacks up above. Countless wind slashers, now ownerless, were loaded onto Parhelion bows. At Prince Yanbei's command, these legendary weapons were launched over the walls like the most disposable of iron arrows. Their blades spun like dandelions blooming in mid-air, rending the wind itself with their passage, carrying the names of the fallen as they pelted toward the incoming waves of Western hawks. Chang'e hastily swiped his fingers across his dust-covered field scope and reaffixed it to the high bridge of his nose. Load the second batch of wind slashers. A young soldier had taken up the role of his impromptu personal guard. When Chang'e spoke, he raised his voice that had yet to crack and relayed the order. Load the wind slashers! He turned to Chang'e and quietly asked, Your Highness, what happens when the wind slashers are gone too? Do we throw rocks from the wall? Chang'e cast him a glance, and the ghost of a smile seemed to appear on his face. Our ammunition and supplies may be depleted, but thanks to the foresight of our emperor, there is still some violet gold in the city. If it really comes down to it, we'll emulate General Han Qi. We'll pour violet gold down the city walls and set the capital ablaze. The Westerners won't find a solitary coin to loot. The young soldier shuddered at Chang'e's indifferent tone. How old are you? Asked Chang'e. The young soldier started in surprise. He said shyly, 18. Chang'e smiled. Don't try that with me. The young soldier rubbed his head. 15. It wasn't unheard of for poor families with too many children to send half-grown kids into the army to live off military provisions. Afraid the army wouldn't take them if they were too young, these stripling boys would commonly fudge their ages. 15. Chang'e said softly. When I was 15, I followed Marshal Gu to investigate Prince Wei's insurrection in Jiangnan, but I understood nothing at all. You're doing better than I was. Far off in the distance, the remaining Western Hawks rose into the air at the Pope's command. They were gearing up for a desperate final salvo. The Western Hawks hefted their ordnance into the air and barraged the city with fire. The long cannons they carried, which ought properly to have been mounted on the iron arms of war chariots, had a horribly strong recoil. Once the artillery fire exploded from one end, the person holding the cannon barrel would inevitably be flung backward to crash to their death. This swarm of Western Hawks rained cannon fire both inside and outside the city ramparts in a suicide mission. Within minutes, half the wall had collapsed under their onslaught. Buffeted by a wave of hot air, the red-headed kite teetered on the verge of capsizing. Screaming for his mother, Imperial Uncle Wang latched onto the mat, but was shoved aside by Zhang Fenghan, who was huffing and puffing after having climbed up the ship. "Your Majesty," Zhang Fenghan had removed his formal court robes. He held a fish maw sack, heavy with blackish purple-violet gold. The swaying of the deck nearly sent him sprawling, and a nearby Imperial guard hurried to take the dangerous item from him in a dreadful fright. "Your Majesty," Zhang Fenghan continued, "we have run out of ammunition. This old subject has delivered the remaining violet gold stores in the city to the gate at Prince Yanbei's request. My subordinates have divided it into—" "Your Majesty, watch out! Protect the Emperor!" A cannon blast interrupted Master Fenghan's accounting. The shot brushed the side of Li Feng's red-headed kite and blasted off a corner of the ship, which began to list to the side with a creaking groan. A second shot followed close to the heels of the first, striking the red-headed kite dead center. The already damaged ship spun out of control. Amid the shouting and screaming all around, Li Feng's pupils contracted into needle points, the light of cannon fire reflected in his eyes. With a roar, Tan Hongfei spread his wings and launched himself toward the attacker, black iron feathers blotting out the sky. The instant he made contact with the cannon, he pushed the Hawk armor to its top speed. The extreme heat and the force of collision sparked an explosion that blew that former member of the Black Iron Battalion, a man who had stewed in his resentment for 20 years, sky high. He and the cannon became a firework blasting off on a one-way journey. But fortunately, Tan Hongfei had not failed in his mission. Atop the city walls, the wind slashers that had reaped the lives of innumerable far westerners finally ran dry. Chang'an turned to behold the capital city. This place wasn't especially dear to him, though it was a pity. He couldn't see the Marquis estate from here. He once again raised his bow, dipped the tip of his iron arrow in kerosene, and launched a shot toward the enemy forces. As the kerosene whipped through the air at top speed, a flame lit at the arrow's tip, streaking through the skyline a shooting star. This was a signal. Master Fenghan rolled up his sleeves. "Ready the red-headed kites." Aside from the one on which Li Feng still stood, the last dozen red-headed kites in the capital floated into the air like a troupe of dancers in festive brocade, twirling with delicate steps toward their mark high above flashing blades and roaring flame. They were laden with violet gold, and they collided with the Western Hawk suicide fighters mid-air. The heavens themselves changed hue. Standing on the city wall, Chang'an took the full brunt of the explosion. The bit of light armor he had equipped for makeshift protection was no use against this crushing shockwave. The enormous force of the blast crashed against his chest. He spat blood, and his vision flickered. For a brief moment, the world went black. The youth who had relayed his orders launched himself toward Chang'an with a cry, attempting to shield the prince with his body. The city wall finally collapsed entirely. Chang'an didn't know how much time had passed when he woke again. It was some minutes before he gradually regained sensation and found that his leg had been caught between two wrecked gears. All that remained of the young soldier who had protected him was a pair of arms torn off above the shoulders. The boy himself was nowhere to be seen. The ardent young man had turned into a courageous and loyal pair of short capes dangling from Chang'an's shoulders. Chang'an gritted his teeth. The pain lancing through his body was bearable. At least, it was nowhere near as bad as a Wuarge attack. He must have been bleeding from his ears because he couldn't clearly hear a single sound, near or far. All was a chaotic, blurry mess. Out of nowhere, Chang'e had the thought, is this what it's like for Zishi when he doesn't take his medicine? It's rather peaceful. The city wall had collapsed. Had the captain been subjugated? Did Li Feng still live? Oh, right. And Gu Yun. Chang'e's courage faltered when he attempted to think past Gu Yun's name, fearing those two syllables should siphon away all his mettle. He cleanly severed that line of thought and curled his body inward, groping for the seam of his greaves to pry open the series of 8 clasps and extricate himself. He had one last iron arrow in the quiver strapped to his back, and his bow was miraculously uncrushed. If he could kill one more enemy, so long as he still had one last breath in his lungs. Just as Chang'e extricated his leg, but before he could stand, a dark silhouette swept across his field of vision. Chang'e had no time to dodge and instinctively leaned his head back, lashing out with his iron bow on pure reflex. A tiny wooden bird clattered to the ground in front of him. The iron bow had cleaved it in two in mid-air, leaving the wad of billow paper it carried in its belly to tumble out. Chang'e stared blankly for a long moment. The Prince Yenbei, who had maintained a frightening degree of calm all this time, began to tremble all over. The airy sheet of billow paper spread across the ground, and he failed twice to pick it up. He was shaking so hard his fingers could scarcely close around it. Only then did Chang'e notice he had lost his vambraces and dislocated 2 fingers, leaving them deaf to his commands. Through the cotton in his ears, he heard someone cry out, "Reinforcements have arrived!" This was the piece of good news everyone had been waiting for. But before Chang'e could summon a mote of joy, his shock was replaced by an unspeakable terror. It was solely by focusing all his resolve on fighting to the last that he had temporarily put aside the real possibility that Gu Yun might have already perished within a pool of molten iron. Their intended journey down the Yellow Springs road had seen a sudden change of plan, and it looked as if he would be forcibly detained on this side of the crossing. Chang'e didn't know what to think. "Dage!" He heard the muffled sounds of someone calling to him. A light-pelt cavalryman dashed over to his location. The newcomer was Gu Chun, with whom he had last parted a number of months ago. Gu Chun leapt off his horse and lifted the battered Chang'e from the ground. He began to explain in a great rush. "Dage, when I got your letter, I was with General Shun, but the southern border—" Chang'e didn't register a word of it. He cut him off, speaking as if possessed. "Where's Zishi?" His voice was slurred, and at first, Gu Chun didn't understand him. "What?" Chang'e waved his proffered arm away and struggled to his feet, ignoring all else as he dragged himself from the city's ruined walls. His back had been wounded at some point, and a large patch of blood seeped through the fabrics of his clothes. Yet the man himself noticed not at all. Gu Chun was dumbstruck. "Dage, your highness!" Chang'e ignored him. Gu Chun watched as a stray arrow flew straight for Chang'e, yet Chang'e made no move to dodge. Gu Chun darted forward to pull him aside in great panic. Within the space of a few steps, Chang'e's eyes had become so red they looked as if they might drip blood. Gu Chun sucked in a cold breath. "Shit! Nothing's happened to the Marquis, right?" Gu Chun had never struggled with indecision. Without further ado, he flattened his hand into a blade and struck Chang'e in the back of his neck, knocking him out cold. That day was the bloodiest battle the imperial capital had seen in all its years of peaceful history. The Son of Heaven personally served as the banner of command. Generals perished in the flames of war, and their forces were committed to fight to the bitter end. Moments before the city wall collapsed, reinforcements arrived at last. These troops were a motley crew in both their makeup and history. At their head was Shen Yi, the commander-in-chief of the Southwest Army, and old General Zhong had emerged from his long seclusion to bolster Shen Yi's authority. Among them were even a small number of Jiangnan Navy sailors, remnants collected by Yao Zhen after the Navy's defeat in the East Sea. Seeing that they had lost the momentum, the Western Army was forced to retreat. Nearly half of the appointed officials of the court had perished beneath the crumbling city wall. Li Feng's red-headed kite had lost steering completely, and Shen Yi had no hawks. Sweating with nerves, he had no choice but to use parhelion bows to shoot iron cables at the railings, then deploy several dozen heavy armor infantrymen to haul them in. It was the middle of the night before they managed to rescue the long-gone emperor from where he had been stranded in mid-air. Nearly all the northern camp had perished alongside their commander. Guyuan had been excavated from beneath a western war chariot. Several of his limbs were cracked, and he was rattling out his last breath, bleeding at the slightest touch and in such a state that no one dared to move him. Finally, old General Zhong personally arrived on the scene, after declaring, "He won't die that easily. I'll take responsibility if he does." He assigned a few medics to secure Guyuan onto a wooden frame and convey him back to the city. The medics combed the entire imperial palace for a few pieces of 1,000-year-old ginseng and kept Guyuan's life hanging by a thread for 3 days. He was nearly reunited with the old marquis several times, but in the end, he hung on until Chen Qingshu was able to rush back from beyond the pass over endless mountains and rivers. Chen Qingshu ran several horses to death along the way and, upon reaching the capital, spent a sleepless night at Guyuan's side before finally snatching the Marquis of Anding from the jaws of death. It was dusk when Guyuan awoke. He could vaguely perceive a haze of light filtering through the window, but hadn't yet gathered the strength to open his eyes when he felt the stab of agonizing pain. "I'm not dead." Guyuan didn't feel like celebrating. What hit him first was apprehension. "Has the city fallen? Where am I?" He thrashed once in his half-conscious state before someone took hold of his hand. That person leaned down to speak quietly into his ear. They seemed to sense his worries and said, "Reinforcements have arrived. Everything's fine. The capital stands." Enveloped in the familiar scent of pacifying fragrance, Guyuan's consciousness fluttered for a mere moment before he sank back under. After a number of days drifting in and out of such a semi-conscious daze, Guyuan finally struggled to full awareness. The effects of his medicine had long faded, and he once again woke as a deaf-blind man without the faculties to appreciate what was right beneath his nose. Guyuan blinked his eyes with some difficulty. A blurry figure hovered at the side of his bed, which he determined was Chang'e by scent. His head was a mess, and a stream of questions poured in all at once. "How many soldiers are left in the northern camp? Where did the reinforcements come from? Whose troops are they? How far has the Western Army retreated? How is His Majesty?" Chang'e carefully helped him take a sip of water. Guyuan reached up for his hand on instinct and accidentally strained one of his many wounds. His vision flashed dark with the pain. "It's all right," Chang'e said into his ear. "General Shen is back, and Shifu is here to oversee everything. Quit worrying and get some rest." Guyuan sucked in a breath, feeling as if every one of his own organs was aching. In days past, whenever he was idle, the Marquis of Anding would bemoan to Shen Yi that no one in 3 generations of the Gu family had been afforded longevity. He felt that such a beset upon, sickly person as himself would also have a beauty's fragile tether to the mortal plane. He had never expected that not only was this crappy tether of his not fragile, it was in fact rather sturdy. All this, and he still hadn't kicked the bucket. Guyuan opened his mouth and tried to call Chang'e's name, but after suffering such heavy injuries and spending so many days unconscious, he was unable to make a sound. Suddenly, there was a touch on his face. Guyuan felt a hand lift his chin and calloused fingers sweep lightly across his lips. a gesture indescribably intimate and tender. If Guyun could have seen Chang'eng sitting at his bedside at this moment, he would have found that Chang'eng had only draped a robe loosely around him. His hair was down, and his shoulders, neck, arms, and even head were covered with needles. The very image of an elegant and graceful hedgehog. He sat beside the bed, stiff as a board, and struggled to so much as turn his head. Every expression of joy, rage, or sorrow had been sealed off his face by acupuncture needles, and he could neither cry nor laugh. He could only maintain a blank expression like a handsome wooden puppet. Even so, red still lingered in his eyes. Over the past few days, while Guyun had floated between life and death, Chang'eng had suffered several wuerge attacks. Chen Qingxu had been forced to use acupuncture to suppress the poison, stabbing into him like a straw man. The straw man lowered his voice, and at a volume inaudible to the half-deaf man before him, murmured, "If something like this happens again, Zuxi, I really will go mad." Guyun was silent. Although he couldn't hear Chang'eng's words, that touch against his lips had reminded him of the disaster that had occurred at the city walls. Guyun desperately wanted to wail in misery. Who would have thought he'd still be alive to deal with this? Struck by his predicament, Marshal Gu froze into a majestic and imposing human pillar from the neck down. Chapter 66. Times of Chaos. Submitting to a momentary impulse was easy, but dealing with the aftermath was an entirely different matter. If not for the great calamity that had befallen the capital, Chang'eng would have never done something so outrageous. Before this war, he had never clung to any unrealistic hopes about Guyun, or he wouldn't have gone off and hid for almost 5 years. Guyun was his lifelong source of solace. But under normal circumstances, their relationship never would have developed into anything more for the rest of his life. Chang'eng had confessed and laid his heart bare, and Guyun had resorted to the most gentle and tactful methods he had used in all his life to make his stance clear. Chang'eng had his self-respect. He never would have made another sincere attempt to persuade him. What he did for Guyun and what sort of path he chose to walk were his own business. Prince Yanbei had a belly full of schemes, but he was unwilling to deploy any of them against Guyun. Any results achieved by such methods would be worthless. With time, perhaps the two of them could have buried these ill-fated affections, this awkward secret, and allowed it to persist in that manner indefinitely, until, with gradual practice, Chang'eng trained himself to casually joke about his past feelings. Perhaps as time went on, someone as thoughtless as Guyun might have even forgotten the whole affair. Chang'eng was accustomed to restraint. As long as he hadn't lost his mind completely, he would restrain himself to the bitter end. Holding desire within one's heart, especially desire of such an unrealistic kind, was an extremely painful thing. Whether it was desire for wealth, for power, or for something else, all were fetters around one's body. The deeper one sank, the tighter these bonds would dig into one's flesh. Chang'eng grasped the principle behind this all too well, and thus had never dared allow his desires to run wild. Unfortunately, no matter how thoroughly his rational mind understood, it was no use, and either way, it was too late. A brief slip beneath the city wall had propelled him to take this step, and Guyun's lack of response counted as a response in itself. Setting aside the question of whether Chang'eng could let go as easily now as he had when he'd no reason to hope, could Guyun pretend none of it had ever happened? As for Marshal Gu, who was currently racked by injury and illness, his head was about to burst from this headache. He felt that, this time, the larger portion of the responsibility was his. He was compelled to guiltily admit that, under normal circumstances, Chang'eng never would have been able to lay a hand on him without his tacit permission. And even if an accident had occurred and he was caught off guard, he shouldn't have been so lenient after the fact. Even Guyun couldn't explain what he'd been thinking at the time. Perhaps he hadn't been thinking anything at all. Whenever he closed his eyes, he could practically see the look in Changgung's eyes, gazing deeply at him as the enemy army approached the city, cannon fire echoing in their ears. It was as if, in all the world, that pair of eyes contained only him. No one could remain unmoved under that kind of gaze. Guyuan had one nose and two eyes like anyone else. There was nothing particularly special about him. He also possessed emotions and desires. He felt joy, rage, and sorrow. There was no way he could return to purely viewing Changgung as a junior he was close with as he did before. But after raising him as a son for so many years, it was difficult for him to accept so suddenly such a shift in the nature of their relationship. Changgung slowly leaned down and covered Guyuan's rather useless eyes with one hand, preventing Guyuan from gazing upon his honorable visage. Not a single part of Guyuan's body was under his control. He couldn't hear, he couldn't see, and didn't yet have the strength to speak. For the first time in his life, he was helpless as another took advantage of him. Utterly shocked, he thought to himself, "He would even bully an invalid? Is there no justice in this world?" He felt a faint brush of breath across his face, and another person's aura drew so close as to be impossible to ignore. Guyuan was speechless. "Fucking hell! This brat really would!" His throat bobbed inadvertently, but Changgung didn't do anything egregious. He paused there for a moment, then lightly brushed the corner of Guyuan's lips with his own. Guyuan's eyes were covered, so he couldn't help but draw out all sorts of vivid and delusional implications from that subtle touch. He imagined Changgung as a pitiful little creature throwing itself into his arms to seek comfort after surviving a terrible calamity, giving him a lick with its damp pink tongue. His heart melted. Guyuan hadn't gotten around to asking about casualty numbers, but he already had a rough estimate in his mind. Even this brief consideration spurred a wave of sorrow. Yet Changgung was here, in one piece, sitting at his bedside. To Guyuan, it felt like he'd reunited with someone he thought he had lost forever. Suddenly, he didn't want to fuss over trifles. He wanted to embrace Changgung, but alas, he hadn't the strength to lift his arms. Tender affections and unspeakable frustrations mixed together in a tangled snarl. He couldn't bear to blame Changgung, so he could only blame himself. He wished to return to that moment when the enemy bore down on the city walls and slap his past self across the face. "Look at what you've done!" Changgung sighed. Guyuan's lashes fluttered across his palm. Right then, Changgung felt as if only sobbing and wailing with this man in his arms could vent even an ounce of the constant, gnawing fear inside him. But he was powerless to make good on those desires. Miss Chun had sealed all his violent emotions and rendered his face entirely paralyzed with her needles, such that he would have to strain with all his might to form even the faintest smile. All Changgung could do was cut a tiny hole for his worries and let them flow out in a gentle trickle. Guyuan's injuries were severe, and his constitution had taken a major hit. His body was weak, so struggle as he might to stay awake, he drifted off before long into a fitful slumber. Changgung quietly pulled the blanket over Guyuan and, reluctant to leave, lingered to stare at him a while longer, until his joints popped sharply in objection to their mistreatment. Only then did he slowly rise, clutching the bedpost for support, and walk away on steps as stiff as a reanimated corpse. Upon opening the door, Changgung was met with the sight of Chun Qingshu, who had been waiting there for who knows how long, pacing back and forth before Guyuan's room. The whole patch of green grass had been trampled flat beneath her feet. Changgung pretended not to notice the casualties strewn all over the ground and made a polite greeting, seeming all the more dignified and earnest for the stiffness of his expression. "I have troubled Miss Chun. Had you not made this treacherous journey, I truly don't know what I would have done." Chun Qingshu waved his courtesies off, distracted. "I'm just doing my job. Your Highness, wait a moment for me. I'll perform acupuncture on you in a bit. And, one other thing. The tongue of this Chun clan member, who was accustomed to seeing every kind of spectacle, tied itself into a knot. and a hint of hesitation appeared on that face customarily as dignified as that of a clay statue. Chang'ung's Wu'erge attacks could not be revealed to outsiders, so the two had pretended he was still recovering from severe injuries to give Chen Qingshu an excuse to come suppress the poison in his body. This was a task Chen Qingshu wouldn't entrust to a single other soul, so she had personally stayed by his side and listened to every word he muttered in his sleep. Unfortunately for her, she had puzzled together the pieces of a terrifying truth, one which left her unable to sleep at night and nearly left wrinkles on her face. Chang'ung wanted to nod, but he was unable to bend his neck. Thus, he could only bow at the waist, seeming ever so polite. There's no need. I can reach all the locations myself. I must also visit the palace shortly, so I won't trouble you. Though they had lost a section of the city wall, they had temporarily broken the siege. However, the cleanup work was yet another headache. Aside from those like Marshal Gu, who truly couldn't rise from their beds, no one dared relax just yet. The city was holding its breath for the next disaster. Chen Qingshu nodded at his response, worries heavy on her mind, and swallowed back the question that had been on the tip of her tongue. But Chang'ung suddenly spoke. If you were going to ask. He paused, then cast a sideways glance at Gu Yuan's tightly shut door. Chen Qingshu's breath caught in her throat. With his immobile, coffin-bored face, he admitted calmly, "It's true. I do indeed harbor improper intentions toward my Yifu." Chen Qingshu was speechless. These words, to hear them spoken in such a calm and confident tone, was quite the discomforting experience. "He knows too," Chang'ung said. "If Miss Chen would—" "I won't say anything," Chen Qingshu responded on pure instinct. Chang'ung cupped his hands toward her in thanks. The outer robe he had draped over his body floated airily in the wind as he stepped elegantly past Chen Qingshu like a graceful immortal striding through the sky. It was quite impossible to tell that he was essentially a hedgehog underneath. If Gu Yuan had cause to feel gratitude toward Li Feng one time in his life, it would have been the next day, when he heard that Li Feng had requested Chang'ung remain within the palace. This was a great relief. Gu Yuan was sorely tempted to submit a memorial to the emperor and request he clear out a room for the fourth prince next to the western warm pavilion so he could move in and never come out again. Injuries on the battlefield were common, and Gu Yuan had long grown used to convalescence. If he was awake, that meant the worst had passed. After recuperating in bed for another day, he regained the energy to speak and take visitors. His first caller was Shen Yi. Because Chen Qingshu had refused to let Gu Yuan take his medicine, he had no choice but to wear his glass monocule in his deaf-blind state and communicate with the man via screaming and gestures. After being separated for over half a year, both men had undergone a complete transformation. When they had parted off to different ends of the earth, both were in their prime and full of vigor. But upon their reunion, one was a bandaged mummy confined to his bed and on the verge of breathing his last, while the other had run himself ragged for months until he looked like an old and withered radish. The old radish, Shen Yi, bellowed his laments to Gu Yuan. "We thought we'd only arrive in time to collect your corpse. We never thought we'd see the Marquis of Anding alive and breathing again. Sir, having survived this catastrophe, you must have a reward of good fortune on the way." Gu Yuan, face covered in spittle from Gu Yuan's howling, immediately began to fret again at these words. Where his reward was, he had no idea. But he sure had a basket full of regrets. He flew into a rage. "You have some nerve saying that to me. Those hairy foreigners made landfall at Dagu Harbor over a month ago and lit up the sunlit palace like a goddamn stove. Where the hell were you, you useless clod? Are you planning to be late to your own funeral?" Shen Yi didn't dignify this with a response. "Get up. Get away from me. Is there a leak in your mouth? You got spit all over my face." "I didn't want to bring this up because I was afraid I would upset you." Shen Yi sighed and rolled up his sleeves, plopping down next to Gu Yuan without a trace of manners. "But I never laid eyes on the envoy sent by the Ministry of War to notify us that the marching orders decree had been repealed." The envoy was intercepted shortly after they left the city. Those scattered sheep droppings nations in the south took advantage of the chaos. Who knows how they discovered those secret passages left behind by the bandits? But they well nigh descended from the skies overnight. I was caught flat-footed, and they managed to blow up the southwest supply depot. There was no way a commander like Shen Yi, who had just dropped from the skies himself, could mobilize the southern border army without a marching orders decree. We were running ourselves ragged, putting out fires left and right. Xiao Ge happened to be looking for me with a message from the little prince. I knew it was going to be a catastrophe the moment I saw the message, but I couldn't be in two places at once. Shen Yi shook his head. Later, a wooden bird arrived with a black iron tiger tally and a war beacon decree bearing your personal signature. I hadn't realized the situation in the capital was so dire. I managed to muster half our forces in violet gold stores and personally brought reinforcements. There was no need to go into detail about the rest. Guyuan could already tell from this brief explanation that the problem was the violet gold. With tigers and wolves attacking from the northwest, neither the Black Iron Battalion nor the Northern Border Defense Corps dared to move a centimeter. If they did, putting aside the question of whether they could still defend the borders, they could very well end up chased down and surrounded themselves. At that point, the capital would be besieged by the Western Navy from the south and the iron-armored wolves from the north. At the same time, Shen Yi had yet to resolve the unrest in the southwest. The most troubling piece was the destruction of the southwest supply depot. The violet gold stores of the southern border garrison were limited in the first place, and what remained wouldn't have been enough to support a long-distance strike. We had to veer north first to sponge off Taibin's army. Shen Yi sighed. But we encountered untold obstacles along the way. Do you know who was successful in holding up the Central Plains army? Guyuan's face went dark. It was a rebel army made up of refugees, Shen Yi said. The majority of Old Tsai's forces had marched out to support the Black Iron Battalion and the Northern Border Defense Corps. The handful that remained in the Central Plains were running themselves ragged dealing with that bunch. They were all our own down-and-out citizens, so it would look ill to deal with them too harshly. But they couldn't just not fight. Old Tsai's hair had gone gray from the stress. Guyuan leaned back against the headboard. How did everything become such a mess? The idle vagrants in the area between the Central Plains and Central Shu had been a problem for years, but they were never able to gather such momentum, Shen Yi said. Someone took advantage of the chaos to goad those men into organizing themselves into discrete armed forces. They saw the nation on the verge of tipping into chaos, saw that even the Black Iron Battalion could lose half its number overnight, and their courage was bolstered. Zishi, lately, I felt it's not good for the Black Iron Battalion to stand out so much. We don't want to make the Emperor nervous, and the people also tell too many tall tales. Certainly our reputation has deterred some interests harboring ill intentions over the past few years, but at the same time, it's too easy for the hearts of the army and the people to falter at the slightest show of weakness from the Black Iron Battalion, even if it's just a false alarm. The two looked at each other for a moment until Guyuan broke the silence. Enough about all that. What's the current situation? How many of our brothers from the northern camp live? Shen Yi's face turned grim, and he didn't respond right away. Guyuan's heart chilled. Where's Old Tan? Shen Yi produced a wind slasher from beneath his light armor, which he silently placed beside Guyuan's pillow. Guyuan froze, accidentally tugging on one of his injuries. He gritted his teeth without a sound, silently curling in on himself in pain. Shen Yi hurried to catch him. Don't! Zishi! Zishi! Guyuan waved away his hand. Voice hoarse, he asked, How far have the Westerners retreated? Shen Yi cautiously studied his expression. After the Westerners routed the Jiangnan Navy, they split their forces in two. One portion, under their Pope's personal command, made landfall at Dagu Harbor and advanced straight toward the capital city. The other was mostly composed of hired Dongying suicide fighters. They drove heavy armored war chariots north along the canal, up through Shandong and Zhili prefectures. The local garrisons had never seen such intense combat, and they scattered near instantly. We traded blows with them once on our march here, and I'll tell you, they were no easy opponent. Later, old General Zhong Chan showed up in Jiangnan and helped Yao Chongzi reorganize the fragmented remains of the Jiangnan army and navy to march north and lend us a hand. The Westerners were forced to retreat to Shandong. Now, the two halves of the Western army have rejoined and pulled back to the East Sea, using the islands of Dongying as their base of operations. I'm afraid this is far from over. Guyuan hummed in acknowledgement, a deep frown furrowing his brow. After spending so long yelling his report, Shen Yi's mouth was dry. He poured himself a cup of herbal tea and drained it, then sighed. Don't overthink. Your priority should be recovering from your injuries. We can't lose you now. Guyuan lowered his lashes and didn't say anything. Shen Yi changed the topic in an effort to lighten the mood. That little highness of yours is practically a whole new person. He kept a low profile before, but at such a time of crisis, he stepped up to take responsibility. I barely recognize him. Did you know His Majesty removed the Bei from his title? From Prince Yan Bei to Prince Yan. Although it was a difference of a syllable, it symbolized a promotion from a commandery prince to a prince of the first rank. Guyuan shook off his distraction and muttered wearily, How is it a good thing to be promoted at a time like this? Shen Yi continued to prod at Guyuan's sore spot in a misguided attempt to cheer him up. I saw him leaving the palace with Chongzi on my way here. I imagine he'll be arriving soon. Guyuan went mute. What is it this time? Shen Yi asked, mystified by the dark expression on his face. After spending so much time cooped up in bed, Guyuan ached all over. He wanted to change positions, but had a hard time shifting himself. The old maid Shen Yi was quite oblivious. Despite seeing Guyuan struggle at the head of the bed, he made no move to help, but continued to blather on. While you were busy playing Wei Qi with the King of Hell, the little prince has been foregoing sleep and rest to remain at your side day and night, heedless of his own injuries. He's covered in acupuncture needles and can't even bend his neck. I feel awful just looking at him. He really is more devoted than a blood-related my ass. Unable to bear it any longer, Guyuan exploded. Where are you coming up with this stuff? Get out! Shen Yi was not intimidated in the least. He impudently pressed closer to Guyuan's face and asked, What? Have you done something stupid and offended him again? I'm telling you, Zushi, His Highness isn't that little kid anymore whom you could tease however you pleased. Don't push. Guyuan groaned. Ji Pingxiong. On account of my great service in nearly martyring myself for the nation, I'm begging you, get out. Shen Yi, keen for once in his life, read the words, I have some unspeakable secret, plain as day on his face. General Shen had suffered Guyuan's bullying for years. He could defeat him in neither physical nor verbal combat and had held his grudges all this time. Having finally grasped the opportunity to poke fun at him, there was no way he'd be willing to let it go so easily. Shen Yi was practically bursting from curiosity. Oh, come on. The entire court is living under a cloud of misery. Let's hear about your bad luck to lighten the mood. Guyuan shut his mouth. The room was silent, and the two who had originally been conversing by screaming into each other's ears switched to rapid sign language. After enough time to burn a stick of incense, Shen Yi floated out of Guyuan's room, a thunderstruck expression on his face and all four limbs swinging out of sync as he attempted to walk. Speak of the devil. It was at this very moment that Prince Yan returned, striding in Shen Yi's direction. General Shen is here. Chang'an greeted him. How is my Yifu doing? Shen Yi couldn't summon a single word. General Shen, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Army, faced Chang'an. A complicated series of changes came over his expression. In the end, he failed to make so much as a squeak before he shrank back against the wall and fled, a look of petrification on his face. Chapter 67. A Libation of Wine. When Chang'eng walked through the door, he saw Guyuan leaning against the headboard, a windslasher mottled with grime laid across his lap, and an expression of indescribable desolation on his pale face. Although he couldn't hear the creak of the door opening, the instant Guyuan felt the breeze blowing in through the doorway, he wiped the look of melancholy from his mien. "What did you come back for?" He had thought Shun Yi had returned, but when he peered through his glass monocle and saw who it was that had arrived, the words caught in his throat. Guyuan's fingers swept lightly across General Tan's windslasher as he thought to himself, "Oh no." In his panic, he wondered, "Is it too late for me to pretend to be asleep?" Honest to goodness, this was the first time in his life Marshal Gu had been so terrified he wanted to outright flee from a confrontation. It was indeed a pity that the world had no goodness in store for Guyuan. Chang'eng walked straight over and picked up one of Guyuan's paws as if naught were amiss. He laid his fingertips over Guyuan's inner wrist and quietly read his pulse. This time, with the assistance of his monocule, Guyuan could see him clearly. Chang'eng had lost a visible amount of weight in the past few days, and his lips were tinged with blue, the blue of someone who couldn't breathe or who was afflicted with poison. The air he gave off was of someone forcibly summoning every ounce of energy to paper over the empty shell beneath. Guyuan felt his awkwardness begin to fade. He frowned. "Where are you hurt? Come here and let me see." "It's nothing serious. Although Miss Chun claims she hasn't finished her apprenticeship, she is truly a master of her generation." Chang'eng paused, then added, "I'll be all right as long as you're okay." Chang'eng would never fill his lungs, extend his neck, and howl to be heard like Shun Yi. His fingertips were still on Guyuan's wrist, so he didn't sign either. Guyuan heard scarcely a word of his speech, but experienced in full the near solid weight of his gaze. Guyuan eyed him. "Kid, what are you saying?" Chang'eng's fingers slipped from his wrist and, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, took hold of Guyuan's hand. It was common for people to be deficient in blood and qi after severe injury or illness, leaving their hands and feet ice cold even in the summer months. Chang'eng cupped Guyuan's hand and rubbed it between his palms, his features earnest in the extreme. Not only did he cover each acupoint on Guyuan's hand, he also attended to the most sensitive spots between the fingers, occasionally sweeping them with his fingertips in the course of his ministrations. This was a bold-faced reminder directed at Guyuan. "I'm not honoring any filial obligations to you. I'm doting on you. Don't lie to yourself." Guyuan awkwardly choked out, "Haven't taken enough advantage of your yifu yet?" Chang'eng looked up at him and smiled. He had a very handsome face, a unique kind of handsomeness that came of his half-foreign blood. His features were sharp, almost harsh, but his aura was so calm that were he to simply don a kasaya, he could impersonate an eminent monk and go about scamming people. This placidity was contradictory, yet neatly suppressed that trace of edge he'd had since birth. When he smiled, he even looked a bit sweet. Gazing through his glass monocule, Guyuan was briefly dazzled by the sight. When a person's attitude towards someone began to change, they began to see the other in a different light as well. Guyuan had to admit for a split second, he felt a brief and indescribable flash of attraction. Guyuan was no monk. He could feel attraction at any time. He wasn't a philanderer who took his pleasure in the face of all moral convention, but he was self-aware enough to know that this was mostly because he usually wasn't in a position to, not because he had no desire to. Thus, he couldn't be too sanctimonious. But this wasn't just anyone. It was his little Chang'eng. Guyuan couldn't bring himself to take this first step. As all the bits and pieces of his meager conscience lined up to harangue him, Chang'eng reached over and began to pull Guyuan's clothes open without the slightest warning. Guilty at heart, Guyuan instinctively ducked back out of the way and gritted his teeth in pain. Chang'eng, whose mind had obviously not joined Guyuan's in the gutter, retrieved some medicinal salve from nearby. He managed to convey a mocking tone even in sign language as he clarified, "Let's change your bandages. I'm not a beast." Guyuan was actually more worried that he himself was a beast. When he came back to his senses, he didn't know whether he should laugh or cry. He chuckled at the irony of it, wondering to himself, how did things end up like this? But laughing tugged at the broken bones in his chest and abdomen. He couldn't laugh, and he couldn't hold it in. There was simply no cure for this complicated emotion. Okay, I'll stop teasing you, Chang'eng coaxed. Don't squirm around. He was afraid to agitate Guyuan again, so he assumed his strict physician's composure to complete his examination. He carefully worked open Guyuan's clothes and reapplied the salve, both men working up a light sweat with the exertion. Chang'eng used a fine silk cloth to wipe Guyuan's body, his motions as smooth and practiced as if he'd done the same countless times. Recalling Shen Yi's words, Guyuan summoned a more serious expression and asked quietly, "Why are you doing this sort of work yourself? It's improper." Chang'eng's eyes darkened. He leaned in close to Guyuan and said, "There's nothing improper about it. I would do anything if it meant having you here to speak with me right now." He was too close, as if they were lovers whispering intimately in each other's ears. The skin beneath Guyuan's ear tingled, but there was nothing he could do about it. If he flinched away, he wouldn't be able to hear. Guyuan sighed. "About that day." "Don't," Chang'eng interrupted him, his voice a bit muffled. "Don't make me think about it. Zishi, take pity on me." Guyuan was still unused to Chang'eng addressing him this way. But even as he opened his mouth to protest, he felt he had no right to ask Chang'eng to call him Yifu either. For a moment, Guyuan had thought to follow the flow of conversation and broach the topic of what had transpired beneath the city wall. Surrendering to impulse was one thing, but what came next? Was he just to allow Chang'eng to go down this incorrect path and give up any chance of begetting heirs? Even if an army rascal like Guyuan was willing to be so shameless as to ignore their former relationship as father and son, how would the court and the Jianghu look upon this Prince Yan who submitted himself to another man? He couldn't do it. Even if Chang'eng weren't an imperial scion but an ordinary commoner, how could Guyuan allow him, someone with the talent, intelligence, and bravery to turn the tide in their moment of desperation, to suffer such humiliation for his sake? Alas, Chang'eng shoved the speech Guyuan had steeled himself to prepare right back into his mouth, and Guyuan lost yet another opportunity to extract himself before it was too late. Carefully avoiding Guyuan's injuries, Chang'eng leaned his head against Guyuan's shoulder and held him for a time. A long while passed before he managed to suppress the anxiety bubbling in his heart. He felt he ought to find Miss Chun and ask her to administer another round of acupuncture. These past few days, the Wu-Er-Ge had been getting harder and harder to suppress. If it kept progressing like this, eventually he'd do something regrettable. Chang'eng steadied himself and reluctantly pulled away. "It's not too hot out today, and the sun is pleasant. Would you like to sit outside for a while? It'll be good for your recovery." A pause. "What?" Chang'eng repeated himself in sign language. Guyuan thought about it, then resolutely replied, "No." He had no objections to enjoying the sun, but he knew he wouldn't be able to walk outside on his own 2 legs for another day or so. Guyuan had no desire to find out how Chang'eng planned to get him there. "Don't you dislike being cooped up inside?" "I changed my mind," Guyuan deadpanned. As if helpless to force himself, Chang'eng put away the salve and rose to leave. Yet, right when Guyuan thought he had successfully dismissed him, Chang'eng turned around, picked up a thin blanket and wrapped it around Guyuan's body without so much as a "by your leave." Then, he scooped up his helpless little Yifu in both arms and carried him steadily out the door. Guyuan was speechless. Outright rebellion! The pair ran smack into Shen Yi, who had fought with himself the whole way out after fleeing in a panic and, still worried, finally resolved to return. Caught off guard by such a scene, Shen Yi sucked in a smoke ring's worth of cold air, tripped over the threshold, and sprawled face first onto the ground. Chang'eng started in surprise. "General Shen, did you forget something?" He asked without the faintest blush or tiniest tremor in his voice. Shenyi laughed awkwardly, then crawled to his feet and began to dust himself off, conspicuously scuffing away the half footprint he'd left when he slipped. It's nothing urgent. I accidentally dirtied the floor. I won't disturb you any longer. With that, the traitorous eccentric turned and ran, terrified that Guyun would murder him to seal his mouth. A lounge chair had already been arranged in the courtyard. Chang'e set the furious Guyun down, then tugged General Tan's windslasher out of his hands and placed it on the nearby tea table. He flashed Guyun an easy smile. What? That year I didn't want to go out on New Year's Eve because of all the people. Didn't you haul me outside in front of everyone just like this? So, Guyun said expressionlessly, having experienced a reversal of fortune, you're all lining up to get revenge on me today? Chang'e chuckled. When he was done laughing, he produced something from his sleeve and pressed it into Guyun's hands. Here. The object was cold against Guyun's palms. He pushed up the glass monocule perched atop his nose and saw that it was a short flute fashioned from white jade. Every centimeter of it was as lustrous as mutton fat, and it was carved from a single piece of stone. The jade was of exquisite quality, and the whole was shaped like a miniature windslasher. The handle, relief, and even the blade slots at the tip were replicated in fine detail, and the character Gu was engraved at the end. At a first glance, Guyun almost thought he had carved that character himself. The handwriting was nearly alike enough to pass for the real thing. You should get rid of that old bamboo one, Chang'e said. The air in the capital is dry. It will crack over time. I told you I'd make you a better one. Guyun ran his fingers lightly over the jade flute and murmured, distracted. I actually don't have a windslasher engraved with my name. Chang'e sat across from him and began to meticulously brew a pot of tea. Steam swirled from the vent in the earthenware vessel as he rinsed 3 cups, one for Guyun, one for himself, and one to place beside Tan Hongfei's windslasher. Guyun continued, his voice subdued. Even Shenyi has one. I'm the only one who doesn't. When I was young, I always felt that the Black Iron Battalion was a set of shackles the old Marquis had forced onto me, that it was to blame for every freedom I lacked in life. Later, when he'd grown up, he felt that these black iron sticks carved with their owners' names were like so many silent final testaments. But he, Guyun, had no father, mother, wife, or child, nor any other mortal ties. In all the vastness of the world, he didn't know who should receive his final testament. Even holding such a thing in his hand would have made him feel unspeakably lonely and chip away at his resolve. For Chang'e's sake, Guyun kept this last part to himself. He went on simply. Those were my petty resentments from before I grew up and understood the bigger picture. Just forget it, and don't repeat it anywhere else. Don't weaken the army's morale. Old Tan was a wild ox who didn't drink tea. Do you have any wine? I've already forgotten. Chang'e signed. There's no wine. General Tan gets tea, and you get plain water. I hope you 2 generals can both make do. Guyun fell silent. Chang'e was getting increasingly impertinent with him. Over the last few days, I've been tallying up our remaining resources with the Ministry of Revenue. Chang'e poured 2 cups of tea and 1 cup of water, then continued to sign. Captain Han sent all the stores in the western outskirts up in flames. Our expenditures from defending the city are also astonishing, and our supply chain from the north has been cut off. If we continue to fight like this, we may rapidly find ourselves unable to afford the expense. Li Feng wanted me to ask you if you had any ideas. How marvelous! After fighting a single battle, such a grand court was out of both money and fuel. Don't look at me for ideas. All we can do is call for a ceasefire. Guyun rotated his cup in his hands. The Westerners actually took more losses than we did. Not only did they supply an army and navy to besiege the capital, they also provided engines and armor to the 18 tribes of our northern border and various nations in the western regions. Returning empty-handed won't bring them any honor. They may not be able to hold out much longer than us. The Western army just retreated offshore. They won't stop at this, Chang'e said. How will the Western Pope explain himself to those behind him if he goes to such expense for nothing? They'll have to make a last stand. They have retreated to the Dongying archipelago to regroup. If they dispatch troops to take Jiangnan and confront our nation's forces from the south, we will end up in a disadvantageous position. Great Liang was too large, and the court too desperately poor. It was indeed easy to attend to one thing and lose sight of another. If it comes down to it, we can send people to the western regions. Our Lolan allies haven't turned against us yet. As long as we're not fully at odds, we can try to smuggle some supplies through there, Gu Yun said. He casually raised his small teacup, holding it with 3 fingers, and clicked it against General Tan's in a toast. Brother, Prince Yan isn't providing wine and wants us to make do. I'm not the boss of him, so you'll have to settle for this. Chang'an silently raised his tea toward the masterless windslasher in a toast, drained his cup, then emptied Tan Hongfei's cup across the ground. A libation for peaceful rest, with tea in place of wine. Chang'an's words were a tragic prophecy. 10 days later, the Western Army gave up their attack on the capital and reorganized themselves to make landfall in Jiangnan. Cutting down their opposition as easily as stalks of bamboo, they charged into Lin'an City after 2 days and 1 night. This fertile land of fish and rice that had enjoyed generations of wealth fell to foreign hands. The noble families residing there were shocked. Some had long gathered their belongings and fled, while others mounted a futile resistance. When that failed, the captured committed suicide in defense of their honor. Li Feng reinstated old General Zhong Chan, who once again donned his armor and rode out to battle, rushing to the front lines with Yao Zhen and an army of hastily pieced-together troops. Gu Yun struggled out of bed for a brief meeting with his old teacher whom he hadn't seen in many years. But there was no time for a long reminiscence about the old days. After downing a cup of unfiltered wine to send off the army on their southern expedition, he watched as the old general, his hair peppered with white, mounted his horse and set off. The next day, the Marquis of Anding and Shen Yi rode for the northwest. Prince Yan, Li Min, revamped the capital's defenses and took up the reins of the 6 ministries. Thus, he began his career as a pillar of the court, shuffling scarce resources to meet endless demands, proverbially demolishing the east wall to repair the west. Well, well, well. We have finished the very first arc of Volume 3, and wow, there was a lot to take in. I don't even really know where to start or where to finish. But the one thing I can say, dang, it's always those dang monks. Liao Chi was a traitor within. And it's so crazy. Like, what? But anyway, the only thing I want to talk about at the end of this arc is actually Gu Yun. More specifically, I want to talk about the internal struggles that he was having while he was recovering and not really able to speak or move and all that stuff. And it's the fact that he was blaming himself for not pushing away Chang'an when he kissed him before they resumed battle. And it just made me think, like, I definitely understand why he would want to blame himself, but at the same time, I really don't think he should, because in that moment, they were in a very desperate situation. And technically, they're still not in the clear from the little bit we just read there at the end. But in moments when you're not sure that one of the people you love most, regardless of how you love them, you're not sure if you're going to see them again, I definitely understand him giving leeway to Chang'an and letting him just kiss him, because what good would it do if Chang'an kissed him and then he harshly pushed him away? What if Chang'an died? Then he would be left with that memory of harshly pushing him away. So even if his brain maybe didn't think of these things in the forefront of his mind, maybe subconsciously, just, how sometimes our brain can work miles a minute, that thought landed in his head like, okay, this may be the last time we see each other. And if this is what he's giving me, I'm going to take it. If he happens to die on the battlefield, I want him to be left with something nice as he's dying. Or, if he lives and I die, I want him to be left with something that maybe would make him happy. That's honestly what I think. So I don't think he should blame himself. But not only that, as it said in that chapter, Guyun is human as well. He has joys, sorrows, desires, and wants and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, I haven't studied the psychology of it, but I think there is a psychology behind ending up liking someone that you find out likes you. And it's one of those things where, except for the usual, when he would come home from war or something, women throwing their handkerchiefs left and right to seek his affections or just let them know that they like him and think he's handsome. I don't think he's had someone show show genuine interest in him, but Chang'e has. And so I think it's natural, not to say that it's always something that happens, but when you find out that someone likes you, especially if it's someone that you're actually close to, it's perfectly reasonable for you to start seeing them in a different light. Just the sheer fact that they like you, your brain may be thinking about it and then, starting to think about them in a different way or starting to know how they act toward you. And then seeing how they act, that may change your own opinions as well. And so I perfectly understand the struggle that Guyun is going through, but I think he should cut himself some slack, and which he could admit that he found Chang'e attractive. I think at some point he'll be able to go ahead and admit that maybe he would like something with Chang'e, because even in a little segment he was talking about, he didn't want Chang'e to sacrifice having children and, sacrifice his dignity just to be with him. And in that moment I was like, he's thinking more about Chang'e and things he may or may not face or may not have than he is just outright thinking, I don't like Chang'e in a romantic way. So anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say about this. Next video, we'll be moving into the next arc. And yeah, I'll see you all next time. Well, I Neiman.